Welcome to Crime Chronicles, where we uncover the real stories behind America's most disturbing crimes. Every case has a beginning, and a truth that deserves to be told. Case 1. Ted Bundy's final and most violent chapter unfolded in Florida, where his behavior escalated beyond anything seen in his earlier crimes. After escaping custody twice in Colorado, Bundy arrived in Tallahassee in January 1978 as a desperate fugitive who knew law enforcement was closing in. Within weeks, he committed one of the most shocking attacks in American crime history when he broke into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. Over the course of minutes, Bundy assaulted multiple women with extreme brutality, killing 2 and leaving others permanently disfigured. What terrified investigators was the randomness and speed of the attack. No kidnapping, no prolonged grooming, just raw violence fueled by a loss of control. Even after this, Bundy continued killing, abducting and murdering 12-year-old Kimberly Leach in Lake City, proving he was no longer trying to hide. Florida exposed Bundy for what he truly was: a serial killer who could not stop, even when the entire country was watching. His execution in 1989 marked the end of one of the most manipulative and dangerous killers in U.S. history. Case 2. Aileen Wuornos operated along Florida's highways, a transient environment that allowed her to move between counties without drawing immediate attention. Between 1989 and 1990, Wuornos murdered at least 7 men after encounters that began as hitchhiking or sex work. While she later claimed self-defense, evidence showed a repeated pattern. Victims were shot at close range, their belongings stolen, and their vehicles abandoned. What made Wuornos especially dangerous was her volatility. She showed little emotional regulation, acted impulsively, and displayed open hostility toward both victims and authorities. Her crimes challenged public perception because she did not fit the stereotype of a serial killer, yet she demonstrated the same predatory behavior seen in far more calculated offenders. During interrogation and trial, Wuornos oscillated between anger, paranoia, and confession, revealing a deeply unstable mindset shaped by years of abuse and isolation. Her execution in 2002 ended a case that still fuels debates about mental illness, responsibility, and justice. Case 3. Danny Rolling was born in 1954 into a violent household dominated by an abusive father who used discipline and humiliation to control his family. Rolling struggled with mental illness, drug addiction, and violent fantasies from a young age, drifting through adulthood without stability or meaningful relationships. In 1990, he arrived in Gainesville, Florida, and began stalking college students living alone or with roommates. Over a short span of time, Rolling murdered 5 students, entering their apartments, attacking them with knives, and leaving behind scenes so brutal they traumatized investigators. His victims were young, full of potential, and killed in places they believed were safe, which intensified public fear. Rolling was eventually linked to the crimes through forensic evidence and a confession he made while incarcerated on unrelated charges. At trial, he admitted responsibility but showed little remorse, often speaking about violence in detached terms. Sentenced to death, Rolling spent years on death row before being executed by lethal injection in 2006. His crimes permanently altered campus security policies nationwide and remain one of the darkest chapters in Florida's criminal history. Case number 3. Gerald Stano was born in 1951 and suffered severe neglect and abuse during childhood, spending much of his youth in institutions where he was reportedly mistreated and socially isolated. As an adult, he drifted across Florida, struggling to maintain employment or relationships, while harboring violent impulses he struggled to control. Throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, Stano murdered women he encountered while hitchhiking or traveling, many of whom were vulnerable and later overlooked by society. His victims included mothers, daughters, and young women whose disappearances often went unnoticed for years. Stano was finally arrested after being caught with a woman he had assaulted but not killed, leading investigators to uncover his involvement in multiple murders. He confessed to more than 40 killings, calmly providing details that helped authorities recover remains and close long unsolved cases. Convicted and sentenced to death, Stano spent years on Florida's death row cooperating with investigators. He was executed by lethal injection in 1998, leaving behind a staggering trail of loss and unanswered questions about how many victims were never identified. Check out this news clip.
In our Central Florida true crime files, a family is finally getting some closure after 4 decades, thanks to some new technology.
The body of a woman who was dumped alongside of I-95 near Port Orange has finally been identified. Fox 35's Marley Capper has more on how this cold case was cracked.
That the woman on the side of the road was a 25-year-old woman named Pamela K. Whitman.
For 43 years, Pamela Whitman's remains were nameless.
Pamela left her home in Indiana to come to Daytona Beach to start a new life.
On November 5th, 1980, her body was found. At the time, examiners believed she was killed 4 to 6 months before she was actually found, and then they had no way to identify her body. Until now.
Forensics and genealogy for justice, they made us an offer to look at some of our missing persons remain cases.
Detectives put the case together and were able to find Pamela's family.
Her half-sister had been looking for 4 decades for answers to nagging questions that kept her literally awake and sleepless nights.
She came to Florida to collect Pamela's remains. Lead Detective Bill Weaver says it was an emotional reunion, but now she feels like a weight has been lifted off of her shoulders. As for Pamela's murderer, Sheriff Chitwood and Detective Weaver believe it was convicted serial killer Gerald Stano.
And like I said, he admitted to 41 killings in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Florida.
Stano was sentenced to 8 life sentences and 3 life sentences, ultimately being put to death in 1998, a sentence Sheriff Chitwood says he deserved.
There's only one way to eradicate evil. You have to eradicate it.
And after 43 years, not only is this case solved, but there's a memorial at the site where Pamela's body was found, saying she had the voice of an angel. Reporting in Volusia County, Marley Capper, Fox 35 News.
Case number 4. Nicholas Jacob Cruz was born in 1998 into instability from the very beginning, adopted as an infant by Roger and Linda Cruz, a couple already facing serious health and emotional challenges. His adoptive father died when Nicholas was very young, leaving his mother to raise him and his brother alone while struggling with chronic illness. From early childhood, Cruz showed behavioral problems that went far beyond normal mischief. Teachers documented aggression, defiance, fascination with violence, and emotional detachment. By elementary school, he was already being disciplined for fights, threats, and disturbing drawings. Mental health professionals flagged him repeatedly, diagnosing him with emotional and behavioral disorders, yet treatment was inconsistent and often discontinued. At home, Cruz's behavior became increasingly volatile, with outbursts of rage, destruction of property, and fixation on weapons. After his mother's death in 2017, the last remaining stabilizing force in his life disappeared, and Cruz spiraled further, bouncing between homes, alienating friends, and posting alarming content online. Cruz became obsessed with firearms, mass shootings, and extremist violence, openly discussing his desire to kill. He made threats to classmates, neighbors, and online users, stating he wanted to become a school shooter and that people would know his name. Law enforcement was contacted dozens of times over the years for violent behavior, animal cruelty, threats, and weapons-related concerns. The FBI even received a tip warning that Cruz was capable of committing a mass shooting, but the information was never properly acted on. Despite a clear pattern of escalating danger, Cruz legally purchased an AR-15 style rifle shortly after turning 18. He trained himself obsessively, watching videos, practicing reloads, and planning his attack in isolation. His anger was no longer impulsive, it became methodical. On February 14, 2018, Cruz took an Uber to Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, the school he had been expelled from for disciplinary issues. He arrived carrying a rifle bag and extra ammunition, blending in among students leaving for the day. What followed was calculated and devastating. Cruz entered one of the school buildings and began shooting students and staff at close range, targeting hallways and classrooms with precision. Some victims were killed instantly, others were wounded and left bleeding while Cruz continued moving through the building. Teachers attempted to shield students with their bodies. Children hid in closets, texted parents goodbye messages, and listened as gunfire echoed through the halls. In total, 17 people were murdered, sons, daughters, siblings, educators, lives erased in minutes. After the shooting, Cruz discarded his weapon, walked calmly out of the school, blended into a nearby crowd, and went to a fast food restaurant before being arrested without resistance. The ease with which he escaped initially only deepened public outrage. As details emerged, the focus shifted from just Cruz to the failures that allowed him to act. His interrogation revealed a disturbing lack of emotion. He spoke openly about hearing voices, feeling empty, and wanting to carry out violence long before the shooting. He showed awareness of the pain he caused, but no genuine empathy, instead framing himself as someone who had been ignored and abandoned by the system. The trial became one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in modern American history. Prosecutors laid out years of warning signs, school records, police reports, social media posts, and witness testimony that painted a clear picture of a young man broadcasting his violent intentions. Survivors and families gave devastating impact statements, describing birthdays that would never be celebrated, futures that would never happen, and the daily trauma of living with loss. Defense attorneys argued that Cruz's brain development, mental illness, and traumatic upbringing impaired his ability to fully control his actions, a claim that divided the public and the jury. In 2022, Cruz was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, avoiding the death penalty but condemned to spend the rest of his life behind bars. He now lives in isolation, removed from society, while survivors continue therapy, families visit graves, and the nation continues debating how many opportunities existed to stop him before he ever pulled the trigger. The Parkland shooting permanently changed school security policies, emergency response procedures, and threat assessment protocols across the country, becoming a case study in what happens when repeated warnings are ignored. Nicholas Cruz did not emerge from nowhere. His story is one of systemic failure layered on top of personal responsibility, a convergence of untreated mental illness, access to weapons, social isolation, and institutional breakdowns. While nothing can justify his actions, understanding the depth of his path to violence remains essential, because the signs were there long before the shots were fired.
Sun shining through the trees may have been the only bright spot on what was a dark day in Parkland last February.
What's going on?
Accused shooter Nicholas Cruz had just been taken down at gunpoint and put in handcuffs.
What's going on today, bro?
The demons, man.
Demons?
And voices are what Cruz blames in the 2-minute and 18-second body camera video released by the Broward County Sheriff's Office Friday. 30 seconds into the video, Cruz acts as if he doesn't know what's going on.
Where am I? Holy what happened?
Shut up.
Just be quiet, man.
The video, an hour after police say Cruz shot and killed 17 people at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, walked to a nearby Subway and McDonald's before being stopped by a Coconut Creek police officer. 50 seconds into the video, he breathes heavily, 2 miles away from where some of the Parkland victims took their last breaths. He then starts to cry.
Case number 5. Joseph Eisel was born around 1834 in the Grand Duchy of Baden in what is now Germany and spent part of his youth serving 2 years in the Papal Army, including a year in Rome before deserting and living in the mountains, a common fate for deserters of the time. Around 1864, he emigrated to the United States and settled in Parkersburg, West Virginia, where he married and worked sporadically as a carpenter or woodworker but struggled financially, spending much of his time in saloons and accruing debts. In 1867, his life took a dark turn when he began a brutal crime spree targeting fellow immigrants and acquaintances he associated with financially. In June of that year, he attacked and killed Joseph Lilienthal in Parkersburg with a hatchet, then later lured Alois Ulrich to a secluded area near the Hempfield Railroad in Wheeling and hacked him to death before stealing money and belongings. And in December, he murdered Rudolf Suter in his apartment by bludgeoning him with a hatchet, shoving a glove into his mouth, crushing his temple and slashing his throat, again taking cash to pay off debts. After a failed attempt on a fourth victim on January 6, 1868, when he swung his hatchet at a coal merchant who survived and alerted bystanders, Eisel dropped his weapon and tried to flee but was quickly captured by police. Once in custody, he was linked to the earlier murders through items found among his belongings and eventually confessed in writing to all 3 killings. At trial, he pleaded guilty to the murders, appeared calm and unmoved as the proceedings unfolded, and was sentenced to death. On March 6, 1868, Joseph Eisel was publicly hanged outside Parkersburg in front of thousands of spectators. His victims, Joseph Lilienthal, Alois Ulrich, and Rudolf Suter, were fellow immigrants whose lives were cut short in a series of senseless and violent attacks carried out by a man whose descent into murder shocked the communities of West Virginia during that period.